this.
Let's do this.
Episode 4?
Yeah, I guess it's gonna be like this is gonna be our first in-depth episode, Andy. And today I must ask Andy.
Yo.
Do you love computers?
Nope.
Do you love women?
I love computers and everybody, so women included in that.
Do you you ever heard the phrase "the future is female"?
I've heard that phrase.
Okay.
I've heard it, but
okay. Have you heard of lesbian neo-reactionaries?
No. No.
Have you ever wondered what it would be like if Jordan Peterson put on the programming socks?
Okay, that sounds interesting.
Well then, today you're going to find out the answer to that question because we're going to delve into Nyx Land.
So Nyx Land is a suit like Jordan Peterson?
No, I actually really respect Nyx Land. I would never call her a suit. Okay. I don't agree with everything she says, and I don't think anybody agrees with everything she says. And that thing about Jordan Peterson is mostly a joke.
Okay.
And later in this series, you'll see where the joke hits. You'll realize it in a little bit. So we're gonna be talking about Nyx Land, and we're going to be reading her semi-famous paper, Gender Accelerationism, a Black Paper. But before we start reading that and doing commentary on it, we're gonna have a little bit of biography. What I was able to get on her. She's a very private person. It's hard to get info on her, but I was able to find a little bit. So she grew up in a very typically conservative household, and around the age of 13, she took an interest in anarchist philosophy.
Oh boy.
But then after that, she took a detour through typically American libertarianism.
Oh.
But she came back to anarchist philosophy around 2014 with post-left anarchism.
I hate that shit.
See, Andy's already got some. Some beef with Nyx Land. But specifically, she got into Bob Black's essay, "The Abolition of Work," and she discusses her thoughts on this essay in her blog post, "Universal Income at the Horizon of Collapse." In that blog post, she notes that she diverges from the post-left in that she believes a lot of post-left anarchist thought has a very reactionary hatred of modernism and technology.
Facts. That's why I hate it. So
yeah. So she will not be returning to Monkey anytime soon. She is not supportive of that. She's actually a really big fan of technology, and it's a really as we read Gender Accelerationism, a Black Paper, you're going to start to see how her conception of herself as a trans woman is tied up in technology, to a huge degree, in very novel ways. So her pseudonym, Nyx Land, that's not her real name, obviously, but Nyx Land is a fun little name. The first part, Nyx, is actually the name of the Greek goddess of night. And of course, that Greek goddess has three sons: Hypnos, the god of sleep; Thanatos, the god of death; and Erebus, the god of darkness. But her name is also a playful reference to Nyx Land, the famous accelerationist and neo-reactionary philosopher. It's kind of hard to call Nyx Land herself a neo-reactionary, because if you read her blog and stuff like that, you do get the sense that she doesn't hold a lot of reactionary ideals. I think the reference to Nyx Land is just that she's being playful with that reference more than anything else, more than it is any real affinity with Nyx Land himself, outside of that both of them share accelerationist tendencies.
Okay.
You know, I mean, but
and accelerationism, for our viewers who some of them may not know what it is, because there's two, in my experience, there's two accelerationisms that live on the internet. There's the assumed accelerationism of like, well, what we do is we vote for Donald Trump, and that's how we get communism, because people will be mad, right? That's the most
you
common.
piss off the proletariat by making the living conditions under capitalism so bad that they end up revolting.
Yeah, that's the most common form
kind of left-wing accelerationism.
Yeah, but that's also not even what accelerationism means in itself, right?
No, yeah, that's left accelerationism. Then there's the right-wing form of accelerationism, which is Nyx Land, which is basically just... Nyx Land advocates the intensification of techno-capitalism and the intensification of it with no end. Just constant intensification.
Yeah.
But accelerationism in general, as a part of my research, I decided I would try to find a kind of pithy short quote. And this one describes more the left-wing accelerationism. So I'm going to read the quote here. This quote comes from #Accelerate the Accelerationist Reader. Quote, "Accelerationism is a political heresy. The insistence that the only radical political response to capitalism is not to protest, disrupt, or critique, nor to await its demise at the hands of its own contradictions, but rather to accelerate its uprooting, its alienating, its decoding, and its abstractive tendencies." And so the idea is that as that accelerates more, then the contradictions will become even more strained. And so you shouldn't wait for the contradictions to naturally come of their own accord. You should try to force it faster and faster.
Okay.
And because Nyx Land is a gender accelerationist, we're going to spend a little moment here going through accelerationism. A few more quotes. So it's almost impossible to mark a beginning for the accelerationist tendency or a single thinker that you can point at and say, that's where acceleration has come from. That's the origin point. It's almost impossible to do that. But Deleuze, who was a thinker who was in many ways an accelerationist or had accelerationist sympathies, quotes Nietzsche, a specific part from The Will to Power in one of his writings. And the Nietzsche quote itself is, "The leveling of European man is the great process which cannot be obstructed. It should even be accelerated." There's even...
What did Nietzsche mean by the leveling of European man?
Well, Nietzsche was a big reactionary, right?
Yeah.
And he was very much so against democracy and at least what at the time would have been socialism. And he thought that democratic tendencies, these anti-aristocratic tendencies, had the ability to, quote, put all of mankind on the same level. It kind of leveled people down to like the lowest common denominator. And he thought that was bad. And instead of fighting against it, as you can see in this quote, he claims that as much as he doesn't like it, it shouldn't be obstructed. Instead, it should be accelerated. I do not know the rest of this quote. I have read The Will to Power, but it's an extraordinarily large book. And so I think that at the end of this acceleration, Nietzsche thinks that there will be some, rising of the Übermensch. I don't know. But right here we see an example of accelerationist tendencies in Nietzsche going all the way back to the 1800s when he was doing his writings. Another great example of accelerationism in terms of Marx, even though I don't think you can say Marx himself was an accelerationist proper, on the question of free trade, he took an accelerationist stance that was kind of limited to the question of global free trade. And so I'm going to read the quote. It says, "But in general, the protective system of our day is conservative, while the free trade system is destructive. It breaks up old nationalities and pushes the antagonism of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie to the extreme point. In a word, the free trade system hastens the social revolution. It is in this revolutionary sense alone, gentlemen, that I vote in favor of free trade." And that comes from a speech by Marx called On the Question of Free Trade from 1984. And our last accelerationist quote...
Wait. Are you saying that Marx was a neo-lib.
Yeah, I mean, we're joking around here. I wouldn't say that he was a neoliberal, obviously, but
sounds like Margaret Thatcher right there.
Yeah, but in terms of global free trade,
basically voted for her.
He took an accelerationist stance,
Yeah.
And coming up for the last accelerationist quote we have here is from Deleuze and Guattari from Anti-Oedipus. And it goes, "For perhaps the flows are not yet deterritorialized enough from the viewpoint of a history and a practice of highly schizophrenic character, not to withdraw from the process, but to go further in, to accelerate the process." So here we're seeing a lot of examples of accelerationist tendencies from Marxism, from kind of anarchist tendencies to even reactionaries like Nietzsche. And so accelerationism isn't so much a tendency towards one type of politics or another. It's more of viewing the practice of politics, whatever your politics might be, as speeding up whatever dynamics are currently present in society so you can reach your desired endpoint. And in Nyx Land is obviously very much so an accelerationist. And in this paper, Gender Accelerationism, a black paper, as you can probably tell by the name, she's going to apply the concept of accelerationism to gender itself.
It sounds like I might be an anti-accelerationist. I think that instead of going forwards, we should go backwards and retrace our steps and find where we went wrong.
Yeah. Okay.
I think
so that not a reactionary anti-accelerationism, but more an idea of like learning from the past, like mistakes in the movement.
Yeah.
And so you don't think accelerationist tendencies are useful? Because I would say I'm for accelerationism at limited times in a limited scope.
I could say that, like, it may depend, right? There could be a situation where you could sell me on it, I think.
Yeah.
But, like, I don't know what that situation would be. And I think overall, right now, it's more of a situation on the left where we have this huge amnesia about leftist history.
Oh, absolutely. And that, I mean, that comes partly from groups like the FBI and CIA constantly disrupting leftist action, even within America.
Yeah.
The destruction of the Black Panthers through various assassinations and whatnot. Yeah.
Yeah, and like, but whenever you do look into the history of the left and you begin to emerge from your amnesia, you realize, like, we've been failing.
Yeah.
Since before Marx was around, we were failing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, since the Paris Commune at least. And, like, maybe the thing to do isn't to just continue to fail. Maybe we should.
And so you see accelerationism in a lot of ways as being like an embrace of the failure.
I mean,
right?
I feel like not necessarily, but it could be, right?
In some ways, in some instances.
In some ways, yeah.
Where you just throw your hands up in the air and
you're just like, fuck it, let's keep doing it harder.
Let's keep doing it harder, and then hopefully that'll produce. I agree to some degree, but
I'm sorry if I'm derailing your thing.
No, you're not derailing at all. Like, the whole point. I want
to bring things up as I think of it.
The whole point of this is that we discuss it, because there's no discussion, then it's just, it's not as interesting.
Yeah.
But that being said, I feel like now we're gonna jump into like the reading itself of Gender Acceleration.
Oh God, this is long.
A black paper, and it is long, and so we're probably gonna take it in chunks. And
here, let me see.
I want to note.
Let me have a look-see daisy.
Oh yeah, it's long, all right, but it's not too long. Don't worry, folks.
Okay, every 3 or 4 paragraphs, I'm gonna interrupt you.
That's fair. No, that's fair. But this was written underneath Nyx Land's old pseudonym, which was Nyx, with the I replaced by a 1. And this was when Nyx Land really blew up. Before then, she was writing back in 2016, and she was picked up by the website Vast Abrupt. And so I don't think she's the owner of the website or that she runs it, but people took notice of her writings, and it kind of culminated after a few years in the black paper. So let's begin. Part 1, The Castration of Multics. July 1st, 1963. Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Cambridge. America is in the midst of a Cold War. The masculine fire and fury of World War II has given way to a period of cooling in the new digital war of information. Two titans prepare to enter into battle for the dominion of Gaia, to claim their perfect sky from the moon and rain down missiles onto Earth. The Cold War's primary theater is a space race. The Soviets have become the first to master the skies with Sputnik in 1965 and Luna 2 in 1959. America is getting nervous. In 1958, Dwight D. Eisenhower appoints MIT President James Killian as presidential assistant for science and creates ARPA, later to become DARPA. Despite the consensus among academics at the time that computer science was essentially an oxymoron, the newly created government program invests millions of dollars into researching computer science. Naturally, MIT becomes a major influence on the rising field and a hotbed of the fledgling hacker culture that had its predecessors in groups like the Tech Model Railroad Club. The flows of capital dictated that time spent on computers was incredibly valuable and had to be parceled out in shifts to MIT, to academics, and IBM. This led to the creation of the first operating systems to provide a common environment of software and allow programmers to work more efficiently. Nevertheless, a computer was still only capable of having a single user driving it at a time. Each user, in a sense, had complete ownership over the machine while using it, which was antithetical to efficiency. It was not enough to create a shared environment of software. What would come next would be one of the most important examples of time sorcery in the modern age.
Okay. So
how you feel about this intro, Andy?
Okay, so
They're spitting history at you.
So they're doing some things that I hate, like this poetic flourish here, where they're like.
You're not a fan of the poetic flourish? I love it.
I like it and I hate it. Like talking about two titans, so we're getting kind of Greek, and then like talking about the dominion of Gaia, and they're talking about fucking the United States and the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Right, and so. I don't know. I just hate that, and I love it too. I mean,
well,
it's cool.
I'm a big.
But let's not get too caught up in that. Let's focus on. They're talking about the background of what they're going to be
talking about later, eventually.
Yeah.
And I want to let everybody who's listening know that I did do research on the vast majority of her references. Yes, MIT's. President James Killian being appointed by Dwight D. Eisenhower, that is historically accurate. And, the creation of ARPA and DARPA, these are real organizations that do work on mostly military technology. And I can tell you, based on my research, that the vast majority of this I was able to confirm as being historically accurate.
I know about DARPA from playing the Metal Gear series.
Yeah. So next time you play Metal Gear, look out for that.
Yeah.
And so I can confirm that this is historically accurate information at the very least. And the thing you got to understand is that Nyx Land was like heavily influenced by Sadie Plant. And Sadie Plant was a part of the CCRU, which was the Cybernetics Culture Research. I forgot what the U stood for. But regardless, this is the same place that Nyx Land, this kind of organization, the CCRU, is the same place that Nyx Land, not Nyx, but Nyx Land and Mark Fisher came out of.
Okay.
Believe it or not.
Mark Fisher is a left-wing accelerationist.
I don't know. I've read enough Mark Fisher to love what I have read about him. I've read some of his essays. I don't know if I would say, is Mark Fisher an accelerationist? Have you read?
He's listed on the Wikipedia page for accelerationism as a left-wing accelerationist.
Really? Okay.
I don't know if that makes
him
one.
That's interesting.
But
I feel like Sadie Plant is the person we really need to hit up in here to understand Nyx Land. Sadie Plant wrote a book called Zeros and Ones. And to make a long story short, Zeros and Ones is a book that talks about the early influence that women had on computer programming and that kind of lost history, Mm-hmm. And so I feel like Nyx Land, by writing out this history of the development of computer software and computer science generally is kind of taking from that tradition in Sadie Plant. And I think she published the book Zeros and Ones in the late 1990s. I think was the one.
That's interesting.
So we already see her like establishing, or we already see that influence kind of coming through. But as you'll note in the third paragraph we read, it talks about the flows of capital dictated. And here we see a kind of influence of Deleuze coming out. It's kind of hard to tell if she just borrows a vocabulary of Deleuze or if she's influenced by the concepts and to what degree. But it's already talking about flows. And if you've ever read Deleuze, there's a lot of talk about flows and the flows of capital and whatnot. And in this paragraph, she's talking about the way that the needs of capital affected how time on these very expensive machines, which were not common at the time, how time was doled out to various researchers. The need for profit or the need for future research kind of dictated how that time was doled out. But continuing...
Hold on, before you continue.
Yeah.
Are we going to read this entire essay?
No, I think we should just do like the first two sections.
Okay.
Like I think that would just be like the best idea.
Okay.
So to continue, back to the black paper itself. In a Faustian bargain with ARPA, J.C.R. Licklider, the director at the time of MIT's Information Processing Techniques Office, utilized the support of the U.S. government to develop a time-sharing system for computers that would better distribute precious computation resources and further his vision of a man-computer symbiosis. His project appealed to ARPA's aims to fund technological developments to aid in the Cold War, and would lead to the creation of a Project Mac on July 1st, 1963. On receiving a $2 million grant from ARPA, Project Mac would lay the foundations for modern computer science. The ninth floor where it operated became a hacker community unlike anything the world had seen, renowned among young grad students hoping to prove themselves and enter the elite open aristocracy of hackers. Yet from the very beginning, the project was riven by the tension between the MIT hackers and its military origins, an incompatibility that would lead to its downfall. Despite the vibrant synthesis of art and science that the MIT hackers would produce, Project Mac was first and foremost a military-industrial project, whereas the hackers had a culture of openness and sharing. It existed underneath the heel of the IBM, ARPA, and MIT bureaucracy. The goal of creating a time-sharing system was realized with the CTSS, Compatible Time-Sharing System, but it was by all respects a project born out of the same phallic techno-industrial masculinity that was lurking behind the rise of modern computer science. It was all merely an abstraction of the same fire and fury that had torn the world apart 2 decades later. The importance of CTSS as arguably the first...
decades prior.
Oh, yeah. So the thing is that, World War II ended like 1940s, right?
Yeah.
And at the time that all this stuff was happening was around the 1950s and 60s. And, of course, this was all a part of, the Cold War.
Yeah.
Because America had an enemy in the USSR, it was now motivated to develop all these technologies, and maybe it wasn't before. As far as all this stuff about the MIT hackers, I literally could not find anything on that, as hard as I tried. Now, it might be true. It might be, like, a real thing, but I have no idea to say either way. So I'm just going to have to take her word for it, and because it's her paper, we kind of have to kind of understand.
Does she not cite sources or anything on any of this?
On some of them, she does cite sources, but if you'll notice...
Project Mac?
You'll notice there's nothing about MIT hackers. Project Mac, I found, was a real project. It was indeed funded by ARPA. It did indeed receive a $2 million grant, so that's solid. The only thing that is a little bit off, and I don't want to say it's off because, yet again, I found nothing to contradict it, was the part about the MIT hackers.
Okay.
That's the only part I found. But continuing...
The importance of C.
Oh, yes, the part on the importance. Okay, the importance of CTSS as arguably the first time-sharing system to be used in a real production environment cannot be overstated. But it was largely the work of MIT professor F.J. Corbett alone, and had strict security standards that meant there was little room to hack the system. Running on a $2 million IBM machine and written by a single man, it essentially represented the height of hyper-masculine proprietorship and instrumentality. And it was hardly a coincidence that this made the system very rigid and fragile, with its security measures regularly being circumvented by clever hackers. CTSS could be looked at as a symbol of the pre-industrial phallus for its rigidity, simplistic security, and king-like rule of Corbett and MIT, as the vested corporate interests of General Electric and Honeywell stopped in along with the bureaucracy of IBM, MIT, and ARPA. An apt symbol of the post-war techno-industrial phallus was born, Multics. So...
what's going on here?
So, okay, she's talking about, the phallus. And at first you will be tempted, and I would not blame you, to kind of roll your eyes at this use of the word phallus when talking about the kind of rigid structure that was instantiated in Multics.
No, I'm down with it. I'm down with that.
But surprisingly, to kind of further feel out why she's using this kind of Freudian terminology of the phallus to talk about these computer systems and the way they were set up and the way that the flows of capital affected them, we'll have to get a little bit further down in the essay. So just put a pin in the use of phallus, and I swear to you that later in the black paper, you will be glad that you did.
Okay.
Because it gets really weird later on.
I'm not upset about it, so...
Yeah, I mean... but just for the time being, think of her use... This isn't fully what it is, but think of her use of phallic kind of imagery as being a way to denote rigidity, kind of being plugged into the military-industrial process, and also being the use of technology for instrumental ends and whatnot. So anyways, expensive to develop, slow to run, and instituting draconian measures for security and efficiency, Multics became loathed by the MIT hackers. Early developments in cybernetic chronomancy made in the name of keeping up with the demands of capital gave way to solutions developed by bureaucracies. Solutions informed in no small part by the egos of those charged with managing those same bureaucracies. Users were charged for memory, disk space, and time used on machines running Multics. Like CTSS before it, the hackers would defiantly crack Multics' security system as a matter of duty, and effectively engaged in a guerrilla war against a bureaucracy that was doing everything it could to try to restrain the process it had set in motion. The bureaucracy nonetheless insisted that Multics was the only way to program and was the operating system, and continued development for some time. Ultimately, Multics development was scrapped by Bell Labs in 1969 due to cost, results not meeting ambitions, and the continued resistance of the MIT hackers. Throughout this time, the hackers had worked on various iterations of what would eventually become their replacement for Multics. The new operating system was initially a single task rather than time sharing, but unlike Multics, it was small, portable, and hackable. As opposed to the unwieldy and monolithic Multics, their new system was designed not as the be-all, end-all solution for operating systems, but was rather a system designed to facilitate the development of other systems and softwares. This new operating system would later be named Unix. Phonetically, Unix, as in somebody who has been castrated, for being a castrated Multics. And so this first section, this sounds really weird. So I had to do some research into Multics and Unix, and
they took the balls off the rigid.
They removed the phallus. So the thing is that when she's talking about the MIT hackers, and the fact that they were charged to use memory and disk space and whatnot, if you're one of those guys who wants to use the system and you have to pay for fucking disk space and memory and all that other kind of stuff, you probably want to find a way to hack it, kind of like in the same way you're going to hack your iPhone to unlock certain features, right?
Yeah, you want to be free.
You
want to be under control.
And so here comes techno-capital. And techno-capital, of course, wants to prevent that.
Yeah.
And so she's claiming that these hackers came up with another operating system.
Unix.
Called Unix.
UNIX, not EUN.
X, yeah. Exactly. And so the thing about Unix is that it later became the basis for the Linux operating system. And I want to go back to my notes here because there's a really good bit on it in my notes. Quote, Unix systems are characterized by their modular design. It's sometimes called the Unix philosophy. According to this philosophy, the operating system should provide a set of simple tools, each of which performs a limited, well-defined function, a unified file system, and an inter-process communication mechanism known as pipes.
What? Pipes?
Yeah, it's just terminology. Like, don't get hung up on too much.
Is the internet really a series of tubes?
Well, this isn't even about the internet. This is before the internet became a big thing, I guess.
I'm just memeing.
But regardless,
outdated memes that no one remembers.
The Unix system was used to combine these tools to perform complex workflows that you necessarily couldn't do on Multics, apparently. So probably the most salient feature of Multics, one of the main consequences of it was that it could only be run on really specialized hardware, which is, yet again, fucking expensive.
Yeah.
The idea behind Unix is to have an absolutely minimal system that could run on minimal hardware and could be implemented by very few or even sometimes a single person. And so if you're trying to escape these flows of capital, being able to be run by a minimal team and not having to require specialized hardware and all this other kind of shit really does help you kind of escape the constraints of capital upon your use of a computer, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the importance of talking about the castration of Multics going into Unix. Because if the rigidity and the capture by capitalism of this operating system Multics, if these hackers come around and develop Unix, which allows them to break free from that, you can symbolically view that as, symbolically the castration of Multics, right?
Yeah.
And so that's where this phallus language is kind of coming in. Is that all coming together for you?
Yeah, no, I mean, I was picking that up.
And so that's part of what I enjoy about Nyx Land. And the second section, which I feel like we can go into, and it won't be too long before we kind of end this. As this essay goes on, it gets a lot more fun. It goes from this kind of history of computer science, later into talking about castration, and then mythologically viewing this castration and whatnot. And even after this next part, it gets even weirder. It talks about hypersexism and the gender shredder and crazy shit like that.
Hypersexism.
Hypersexism, yeah.
That sounds like a reference to Nyx Land's claim that he's a hyper-racist.
It is, surprisingly. But let's get started on the next section, which is computer science and the black circuit. As well as a historical fact, the castration of Multics can be read mythologically as a reoccurrence of the ancient theme of a castration from which the new world is created, or symbolically as a castration of the abstract state corporate phallus that America would attempt to wield to rule the new world. Computers then, and long after, were thought of merely as tools, means towards other ends, and the investment ARPA had put into Project Mac, along with the investments of various corporate interests, was thought of merely in terms of better ways to manage large military-industrial systems. One system, one technocracy, one new world order. All of these dreams died when Multics became the replicant Unix.
C-U-N-T.
With C-U-N-T. And here's where like the fucking edginess of like Nyx Land comes out with the use of the word replicant. I swear to you, it gets weirder. There's people who will spell America with like 3 Ks.
Yeah, America,
Yeah, and whatnot. And I guess Nyx Land is kind of flexing that here with replicant,
instead of replicant.
Yeah, because if you're castrating Multics to get to Unix, you're moving it away from the phallus. I guess you're getting closer towards cunts, right?
Yeah.
Multic's purpose.
That's silly.
It is silly, and it is one of the things about Nyx Land that will make you cringe, unfortunately. But
no, it's great. It's fun.
But we're getting into the weird, and don't worry. Eventually, when we're done with this, I'll tell you a fun story about a Discord server that got hacked by a porn obsessed Hindu nationalist, and sent sissy porn to a Twitter page of a college frat. But I'll tell you that story later, though. That's a good one. That's a good one.
This kind of shit reminds me of this is like some shit that would happen in The Wired on Lane or something.
Well, yeah.
These weird, I don't know.
These weird motherfuckers just being weird.
Hole in the wall.
I mean, isn't weird the funnest though?
Yeah.
It is the funnest. That's why I chose this as a subject of our first well-researched episode. But regards Multic's purpose as a monolithic and eternal system for doing everything, the one, was ultimately replaced by a void, a zero. Unix was not the system for doing things, but rather a smooth space through which creation happens, that fluid being that makes transition possible, a vulva, a woman. Unix was, however, still owned by AT&T. The strides in time sorcery made under Project Mac had to be re-territorialized by making it at first revert back to a single-user system. And re-territorialization would happen once again a decade later in 1983 when Bell Labs was broken up by an antitrust act, which led to AT&T quickly turning Unix into a product and closing the source code. This would become known as the death of MIT hacker culture, though once again the future would arrive from the past with the rise of the GNU project. So, you see here, she's extending the kind of metaphor of the relationship between the phallus and technology, and all of this kind of almost Freudian. She doesn't take influence from Freud, but this language is almost kind of Freudian in terms of castration and whatnot. And she talks about the void, a zero, replicants. And she's almost doing... You've heard of pareidolia, right?
No.
So pareidolia is the tendency of human beings to see faces and shapes of animals that aren't really there.
Yeah.
And so, sometimes I read this and I can't feel that she's doing a conceptual pareidolia between, ones and zeros in programmings, and between the phallus and the vulvus, and then drawing a connection between the vulva as this kind of deterritorializing machine. There goes that Deleuzian language that allows for birth, and I'm certain she herself is aware of that, and she's not being literal. This is kind of all metaphor to kind of make her point further down the line.
Yeah, I mean, the real question is what she's doing useful?
I think it is when you get later into it. I think she goes into some weird places where it stops being useful, but then it comes back to being useful again. But also, going back to what we mentioned earlier, the influences from Deleuze, they're talking about re-territorialization and deterritorialization and smooth spaces through which creation happens. That's very Deleuzian language.
I don't know, though, but maybe my... To maybe do some pareidolia myself, maybe my emphasis on the usefulness of what she's doing is itself some rigid
phallic, yeah, maybe
philosophy.
Yeah. Andy over here is being phallic, everybody.
Yeah.
Simping for the heteropatriarchy.
Hey man. what can I say?
And so,
shitlord.
For those who don't know, when we're talking about re-territorialization and deterritorialization, deterritorialization is the process through which concepts in the broader culture and borders and maybe your image of yourself gets kind of broken down and gets destroyed. And re-territorialization is kind of the building back up of borders, of certain parts, certain concepts in the culture. And so when she's talking about...
So is it like an interpretive thing?
Yeah, she says right here in this part where she says the reterritorialization would happen once again later in 1983 when Bell Labs was broken up by an antitrust act. So when Deleuze talks a lot about reterritorialization and capital and the flows of capital, if you look at, say for instance, to make it relevant here, computer science and it requiring a lot of capital to do this initial research into computer science. It couldn't be like one individual, right?
Yeah.
It took a shit ton of money to build the hardware.
Yeah.
Remember, computers used to take up entire rooms. They weren't these small little things. That's a lot of metal you got.
And not just hardware. You need people like coordinating and like collaborating. And
so when they developed, according to her, when the hackers developed this Unix and it could, be run by a single person on much less expensive hardware. That kind of deterritorialized this computer technology, because then it was no longer being defined by the interests of capital or the state in this rigid kind of way. Then you could have hundreds of people affecting the development of computer science.
Yeah.
And so in that way, it was kind of a deterritorialization from the way it had been captured by capitalism and the state, and the way its development had been directed by capitalism and the state. And so that's kind of a practical way to think about deterritorialization. But then she talks about the reterritorialization that happened when Bell Labs was broken up by the Antitrust Act, which led to AT&T, quote, quickly turning Unix into a product and closing the source code. And so when you close the source code on a product, and even you turn it into a product, there's yet again capitalism reterritorializing Unix. It enters again to kind of direct its development in a kind of rigid way.
How do they close the source code? What is that?
So I am not an expert on computers, but if you go to your browser, and I did this back when I was a kid in middle school, there should be an option somewhere to view the source code of the page, of the HTML.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so I understand that they can hide the source code on their product itself.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But Unix was still this open project.
Well, I imagine the product they made that had their modified Unix was probably closed, so you couldn't modify the product.
So by closing off their product, they were able to like undermine the open communication that existed outside of their product.
Well, that's where the next part comes in, where she talks about Richard Stallman, former MIT hacker. I'm going to quote Nyx again here on the next part. Richard Stallman, former MIT hacker, would copy Unix and create a rigorously free software ecosystem with the GNU project. GNU was ultimately completed in 1991 with Linus Torvalds' development of the Linux kernel, the lowest level and most crucial piece of software in an operating system, built on the principle of the MIT hacker culture of the past. GNU/Linux was licensed to be 100% free, as in not just price, but as in freedom, with no artificial barriers to copying or modifying. In this time, Unix had branched out into various commercial versions, all while GNU grew its tentacles invisibly. Perhaps its campaigns even served to distract bourgeoisie man from the really dangerous guerrillas in the mist, says Sadie Plant. The new hacker guerrillas who had once again undermined the efforts of yet another hypermasculine, abstracted, phallic project. All while various commercial Unix versions were vying for dominance, GNU/Linux quietly arrived. Unix and later GNU/Linux took the notion of time sorcery pioneered by CTSS even further. The development of proprietary software depends on a notion of linear time, project goals, and deadlines, a chain of command. Developing free software is anything but this. The free software community is a chaos from which order arises, where time is detached from both the notion of single user on a computer at a time, as well as a single user or team writing code at a time. Code seems to form itself through the programmers and comes from all different points, from pull requests not yet merged into master branches and old software being renewed, copied, modified. Free software warps from various points in time. Today, nearly the entirety of the web runs on GNU/Linux. and almost every personal computing device in the world runs on Android. I assume she's talking about phones here and not your desktop, which is built in the Linux kernel. The majority of applications are transitioning away from desktops towards the web, while Apple and Microsoft have long fought to control the desktop, still in the same mindset as Project Mac decades ago, that computers would primarily serve as tools to make secretary work and communications more efficient. The numbers, however, don't lie. GNU Linux has already won. So, I think this is more of her just tracing that kind of technological development. Are you okay, Andy? Is this killing you?
I don't know, like...
Are you regretting this choice of subject?
She probably knows more than me, but no, I'm not regretting it. But I feel like nobody uses a computer, a personal computer that has Linux. Just because your web browser apparently operates off Linux,
and maybe your Android phone does.
Yeah, but the web browser is running on your desktop, which is not Linux.
Yeah,
and
it's running off of Windows.
And no normie has access to Linux, really.
Okay, so this was one of my hangups on the research. I caught that too, and I was like, okay, Nyx Land, this feels really fucking shaky, you know, and so I decided to look a little bit closer into this development of Linux and Unix, and I'm not certain, but I want to give Nyx Land the benefit of the doubt here, because Nyx Land herself apparently is a computer. I don't know if she's a computer programmer, but she is involved in the field of computer science some way.
Yeah.
She's a very private person, so she doesn't give out a lot of details. But regardless, though, getting back to the original point, I think there's some way that this Unix model of running things on a modular design, quote unquote, the Unix philosophy, where these simple tools combine to perform complex workflows. That might be something that Windows does, even if it's not technically called Linux, or even if it's not based on Linux. You know,
so
I think that might be where she's coming from with that.
Some principles of it are
present in most operating systems today, possibly. Okay. I might be wrong about that. Don't quote me on it, folks. But
at any rate, I'm not trying to say that
she's wrong.
She's wrong
because we don't know enough about it.
Yeah, exactly.
You know.
I'm listening. Go ahead.
Yeah, Andy's just taking a stretch.
Yeah.
And so we're reaching the end of the last section before we get to the hyper-sexist gender shredder.
Are we gonna get into the hyper-sexist gender shredder?
Do you want to try and get into it?
I don't know how long. Pull up an assay. How long has this episode been going? How long we've been recording?
Well, let's see how long we've been recording, Andy. It's been 48 minutes, so yeah, let's just finish it off and end here before we get back to the hyper-sexist gender shredder. I guess that'll be part 2.
Yeah, because you want them 30-minute episodes. Anyway, let's go. Let's keep going.
In Zeros and Ones, Sadie Plant traces a history of computer science up until Alan Turing that seeks to explain how it is that women and computers seem to have such close histories. From the first computer programmer, Ada Lovelace, to Alan Turing, to Grace Hopper, some of the most important figures in computer science were women or very feminine men. It's also well known that the earliest computer programmers were women, back before computer programming was even understood and before it was taken seriously. Computer science was originally thought of as being the same thing essentially as secretarial work, and like secretarial work, it was imposed on women. The biological duty imposed on women to be the productive space from which the future is produced, to be carriers of genetic information, extends out into secretarial work. They are treated as a productive space for data to pass over, and it was only the realization that programming was complicated work that led to women being pushed out of the industry. And so, okay, I can also confirm that this kind of early closeness between women and early computer work is also historically accurate. Okay. Because if you look at the people who were working with the computers at NASA, the vast majority of them, and they were mostly working with like punch cards and punch papers, and I found pictures of them standing next to these giant books of like the computer punch cards, right?
Yeah.
Almost all of them were women.
Yeah.
Like many women.
Yeah.
And so this kind of connection between women and computer programming and it early on being viewed as kind of secretarial, like women's type work,
Uh-huh.
that is actually historically accurate. So I can 100% give Nyx Land that.
I mean, the amount of things that are historically accurate in here makes me feel like Nyx is probably right about the
Linux thing.
Linux thing.
With the, yeah.
I'm just still,
You're stuck on that, and that's okay.
Yeah, it just seems unlikely that I've been using this much Linux whenever I don't know shit about Linux. And I tried to use, like, this is really where I'm coming from. I tried to use Linux in high school.
Yeah.
I had like a dual partition on my computer, and like I had what was that? Ubuntu. I did Ubuntu on one of the partitions, and you know I had the whole thing with the.
And it doesn't feel like anything like a Windows computer, right?
It was so difficult to use. You had to, like, in order to install like World of Warcraft, for example, you can't just install it. You have to download. You have to install Wine, which is like a Windows emulator software, and then you have to like. You install World of Warcraft onto your emulator or whatever, but then like it's all fucked up. So you have to go into like forums and you have to find out like the reason it's fucked up, and then you have to like
fuck around with it.
You have to copy and paste these like essays worth of code into your little fucking command prompt thing.
Yeah.
And like
it's a lot of fucking,
and
right?
hope that you actually diagnose the problem right, and you probably didn't.
Yeah.
And you probably have to restart.
But what if Windows just kind of smooths that process out and is still using like a modular based system? I think that's what she's saying. But yeah, moving on from that, the most interesting thing I feel like of this paragraph that really stood out to me was the closeness historically between women and early computer work, and the way she connects that to the way that women in kind of patriarchal society are viewed as the productive space, quote unquote, from which the future is born, literally producing children to keep the social production. Of course, you know, Engels talks about that a lot in his famous essay about the family, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a little bit of Marxist tradition also in Nyx Land.
But, I mean, isn't this kind of like, you know, this is weird for a trans person to be writing something that sounds so gender essentialist, at least on the surface.
Yeah, it seems gender essentialist on the surface, absolutely. But yet again, as I say, lots of philosophy is just biography, right? And you'll see a lot of ways in which Nyx Land talks about of her conception of herself as a trans woman, you know? Mm-hmm. And she takes a very like Stallman, I feel like, I'm not sure, I don't know if Nyx Land has ever read Stallman Firestone, but it feels like she takes a very Stallman Firestone Engels view of what it means to be a woman, as a woman being defined as a gender role that's hooked into social and biological reproduction, and that being the main thing that defines womanhood, at least at the beginning. Because Andy, I remember one of your favorite phrases is, where something starts isn't necessarily where it goes.
Yeah.
You know, and I feel like when Nyx Land talks about gender transition and how gender is currently being thought of in these postmodern times, that when she's putting out these seemingly gender essentialist notions, she's not saying that today we should take gender essentialist notions.
I see.
But that's how womanhood first arose in history.
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, for sure. Okay, so
you know what I'm saying though about how like
because as technology gets as technology advances, like that opens up the space to be trans in new ways.
Yeah,
because it opens up the space.
It opens up space to be a woman in new ways, even if you're not necessarily transgender. Right?
Yeah. It opens up the way to be any kind of gender in a new way, because you know, not just things like HRT, but like birth control. You know. Yeah. You know, you don't have to get pregnant if you were born signed female at birth. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. You don't have to worry about that anymore.
Now,
and so then that changes how you view your sexuality, which is very tied up into womanhood as well as it's tied up into masculinity. Yeah. And so I mean, she's starting with these essentialist notions because she's starting with that kind of like history. But regardless, though, what I find really interesting about this section about women being tied into this reproducing the future literally in the forms of childbearing, and then hooking this into the fact that producing children from the womb has a lot of genetic information exchange, just like computers have a lot of informational exchange in the programming and the files that are exchanged. Mm-hmm. And so there comes that pareidolia again, right? Yeah. Like there comes that metaphorical pareidolia that she's using to kind of draw you closer to the thesis of how technology shreds gender. But continuing though, instead of women being given the duty of mindlessly punching numbers into a machine, as programming was once thought of, this task was deferred to the machine itself. But while the intent was to restore the natural order of women, machines being told what to do by men, something else happened. Beginning first with Ada Lovelace, then with Alan Turing, then with Richard Stallman and the free software movement. There is a clear circuit accompanying the history of computer science where re-territorializing masculinity is always pushed aside by de-territorializing femininity. The role of woman as productive matrix has already been replaced virtually by the computer, and at each moment the masculine is being vexed and seduced into a trap where either dies or adapts. The story of masculinity failing in computer science can be seen time and time again in something as grand as the Unix Wars, where every proprietary Unix OS ultimately couldn't help to keep up with the GNU Linux, or on the small scale with the captive economy of proprietary software ecosystems. It is only by vendor lock-in and state patent legislation that proprietary software survives today, a historical network effect that we're starting to see the encroaching demise of. This failure of masculinity maps onto the sorts of people who are involved in proprietary software and free software. Okay, before we get into this next part, I want to put the disclaimer that the views of Nyx Land are not me or Andy's views, okay? Because we're about to get a little bit problematic with this essay.
Oh boy.
So keep the angry fingers off the keyboard, folks. We do not advocate this. And yet again, this section is leading into something else. So you might not find the final thesis to be problematic, you know? But regardless, continuing, the failure of masculinity maps onto the sorts of people who are involved in proprietary software and in free software. The former tend to be your classic businessmen, the classic masculine hunter-gatherers of the modern world, while the latter tend to be genetic failures by the standards of masculine gender roles. Physically and often socially deficient males, the nerd stereotype. Real nerds, not the nerds of today's standards. Nerds with severe social problems. Nerds who neglect their hygiene, have no sense of fashion, who live completely obliviously outside the standards of normal society, who have a deep investment in inhuman scientific systems, and a simple gender role binary, one that by today's standards is highly outdated, but remember that this is taking place in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. These men would be considered feminine. In today's terminology, most free software developers would probably be considered soy boys, yet they won.
Gang, gang.
Soy gang up in the house.
Soy gang.
The striated masculine space of the Java shop, a defined chain of command and bloated phallic programs, is simply obsolete. The smooth feminine space of the free software project, communal chaos, and small simple programs that can couple together with each other in cybernetic configurations has already taken over the world. Perhaps it's no surprise then that as the erosion of metaphysical masculine power becomes realized materially at the forefront of technological acceleration, it coincides with the literal erosion of the male sex. And this is where we're going to end before the second episode in this series. And in the second episode, we'll get onto the section about the hyper-sexist gender shredder. But, as always, we're now going to discuss these few paragraphs. How are you feeling about it, Andy?
It's pretty wild. The communal chaos and small, simple programs that can couple together with each other into cybernetic configurations. That's like her... That's like the force that she's, like, praising here.
Yeah, that she views that as being a good thing. She views it as a deterritorializing force that resists these flows of capture by the government and state apparatuses. And she tends to equate this kind of like she literally just does it in one of the sentences. She equates these kind of deterritorializing forces with femininity.
Yeah.
Because if you're a man and you're trying to engage in production, like hunt the boar or catch the boar and bring it home, and in these hunting groups, you have to have, the leader of the hunting group, and you have to have somebody in this defined role of the spotter, and it's not very fluid, and it's very like rigid and phallus. So that's where I feel like she's kind of coming from.
Yeah.
Of course, unfortunately, ending on this part is these last few paragraphs are really fucking fun paragraphs. I mean, they're really fun and interesting.
You know what's weird about this? Like, do you remember me talking about that theory about how maybe women invented language to describe plants?
Yeah, okay, yeah, you're talking about the McKinnon theory.
Yeah, the McKinnon theory.
The McKinnon theory about women developing language as
yeah, because plants are complicated, and like in order to like eat a plant or find the plant that you need to eat and yada yada, or even, like,
you need to be able to describe it.
Yeah, there's a lot of detail. There's a lot of detail like when it comes to like seasons.
Yeah.
And so like all these early religions with their emphasis on seasonality, there's a big overlap there. But
we also need complex communication for hunting, and if we're viewing hunter and gatherer societies not perfectly, but as being mostly these kind of gendered splits, where the hunter is mostly, a male group. I mean, you need communication for that too, right?
Yeah, you need communication for that, but the kind of communication for that is a lot more basic. Like fucking.
And you're not going to be talking a lot because you need to be silent to keep from scaring the game off.
Like hunting dogs can do it.
Yeah.
They don't have English. Pack hunting, and that's a lot similar to what we would do. We would gang up on some shit. We just have arrows.
Yeah.
So that was our equivalent to teeth. I don't think that hunting requires as much. I don't think hunting necessitates the invention of human language. Is what I'm getting at.
I get you, but I like how we're coming across these kind of similarities between these philosophical ideas in McKinnon and now Nyx Land.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why I'm really obsessed with similarities in philosophical systems is I've developed this idea. It might be kind of a pseudo idea. But the thing is that if Jerry walks outside and he looks at the sky and it's blue, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he comes back to his friend, Thelma, and it was Thelma, the sky is blue. And then Thelma walks out and sees that the sky is blue. She comes back and she tells her friend Johnny, the sky is blue. Johnny has more reason to believe that both of them are onto something.
Yeah.
Because it's multiple people that keep on hitting on this same thing.
Yeah.
Right? And so with McKinnon hitting on this idea of language, which is, and I'm sorry, I haven't explained this before, but which can be viewed as a kind of cybernetic system, and then computer technology being viewed as a cybernetic system, and women being involved in both of those theories, hitting on women being closely involved with that.
Yeah, language is totally a technology of some
sort. Yeah, and also kind of, I know in our current culture we associate cybernetics with computers, and rightfully so, because computers are cybernetic systems. But when a lot of these philosophers like Sadie Plant and Nyx Land talk about cybernetic systems, they're not just talking about computers, though. I want to make this point. When they're talking about cybernetic systems, they're talking about systems in which there's flows of cause and effect, and sometimes in which those systems have feedback loops. Mm-hmm. So in this context, in this philosophical context, when we're talking about cybernetics, we're not just talking about computers. We're talking about any system that has these kinds of flows and feedback effects. And I think we can definitely view language as kind of like a weird kind of cybernetic system.
Yeah.
I imagine in the development of language, there was kind of a feedback loop, mm-hmm. where the more advanced the language gets, the easier it is to make it more advanced for describing more complicated things.
Yeah.
And so in this way, with seeing Nyx Land drawing this close relationship between women and cybernetic technology, and McKinnon drawing this close relationship between women and the development of language, I don't agree with everything Nyx Land says, but I think there is something kind of there, And also, that being said, do you have something to say on that, Andy?
Oh, no.
But you know what I'm saying, though, right? About multiple people hitting on the same thing, and maybe there's something there.
Yeah.
But I think we should cap this off with appropriately the very last sentence. And the very last sentence, we already read it, we're going to read it again. Perhaps it's no surprise then that as the erosion of metaphysical masculine power becomes realized materially at the forefront of acceleration, it coincides with the literal erosion of the male sex. Now, we haven't gotten to this part yet, and this part's a little bit weird, and I have not been able to research well enough to tell whether or not Nyx Land is bullshitting us on this one. But later on in the essay, Nyx Land talks about how over time, supposedly, biologists have noticed that the Y chromosome is getting phased out of various species, including humans.
Hell yeah.
And so here we see, according to Nyx Land, through that process, the literal erosion of the male sex. And so, going back to Marx, all of these cultural aspects have a basis in material reality, right? Material reality is the soil from which the flower of culture grows, right? And the flower itself, how it's going to turn out, whether it's going to be big or small, whether it's going to be healthy or not, what color it's going to be in some instances in some plant species, is going to be dependent on the soil it grows in, right?
Yeah.
And so, if we're taking a materialist conception of gender that seeks to locate how gender operates socially within these material realities, well then, if you've got drones flying in the sky, raining down hellfire upon your enemies, the person piloting the drone doesn't need any courage. They're 1,000 miles away, sitting in a seat, right? There's no courage, and that's typically considered a masculine virtue.
Yeah.
And so here we see technology undermining the need for courage. And then we see forklifts. Well, it used to be there were no forklifts. You want to lift something heavy, you got to get a dude's arm underneath it. Or you got to get a strong dude to pull on a pulley system, right? Which still requires some strength. But now with forklifts and all these machinery doing heavy lifting, what's the point in masculine strength, right? So we have all this technology undermining the material basis of these virtues that our culture considers to be masculine. And I feel like on that point, I want to put a pin on that point, and I want to say that I absolutely agree with Nyx Land on that one particular point. And the older I get, I'm 30 now, I'm 31. The older I get, the more I kind of notice it,
Yeah.
Like it seems like hewing to this traditionally masculine gender role as the decades goes on gets more extremely difficult. And it seems to be more aesthetic than anything else.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like being a freaking Star Wars fan or something,
Yeah, it just becomes aesthetics.
Yeah.
It's like you go to the gym, you eat your red meat, and you bulk up for muscle, but for what? There's cubicle.
You wear your flannel, you grow your beard out, you adopt a paleo diet, and you listen to Jocko Willink podcasts and fucking Joe Rogan,
And don't get me wrong, like I think dudes with muscles are beautiful. I think it's great visually looking, but there's a lot of these dudes that go to the gym and work up all this muscle, and they go to work in a cubicle farm.
Yeah.
Where they don't ever use the muscle, right? Like it doesn't it's so weird. I'm sorry, y'all. I'm saying the word like too much.
Totally, bro.
But on that note, on our next episode in this series on Nyx Land's Gender Acceleration is Black paper, it's going to get even weirder because the next section, the hyper-sexist gender shredder, gets really fucking bizarre.
Gender shredder, you say?
Yes, gender shredder. Oh yeah, they talk about stuff like. More importantly. Oh, whoops.
It's shredder.
Why am I wearing this ridiculous mask?
He's questioning his masculinity.
He's looking at the mask. He's looking at the mask of masculine and shredding the gender.
I'm sorry, I had to do it.
Andy had to do it. But it gets just weirder from here. Because in the gender shredder section, she talks about the Darwinian ratchet of
gender.
And eventually, even after the gender shredder section, she starts getting into Kabbalistic notions of gender.
Just so y'all know, that was Shredder from the Ninja Turtles. To contextualize, it was Master Shredder asking why he's wearing this ridiculous mask. So
the mask of masculinity, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so stick around. You'll love the second episode. It's even weirder than the first one. But on that note, we bid you a goodbye and a farewell. A farewell.
It's the square. Yeah.